Land is the basis of all independence.
Hello, this is Dr. V's Revolution Will Not Be Pesticides, and this is going to be a history video about the West African ethnic group known as the Igbo. Okay, Igbo. It's spelled I-G-B-O. Alright, so now the Igbo are a very, very interesting group to me because I actually wrote my dissertation on the island of Dominica and the African Maroon community in that island. And our Maroon community is basically a runaway slave community. And the Igbo were the predominant ethnic group that were passing across the Atlantic Ocean from the west coast of Africa into the ports of Roseau and Dominica. And so I had to learn a lot about the Igbo and understand the cultural backgrounds and things like that of some of the enslaved Africans and the subsequent Maroon community as well. So they have a very special place in my heart for me. So, but the Igbo are, just to give a little background about the Igbo comprised of about 12% of all Africans that were transported during the transatlantic slave trade from the west coast of Africa into the Americas. All right. The leading group is the West Central Africans, comprised of about 45% of all Africans transported into slavery in the Americas. The Africans from the Bight of Benin are about 16%, and so the Africans from the Bight of Biafra are about 12%. All right, and these Africans mostly comprised of a large portion of those who were transported into the British West Indies. So the British actually frequented the coast of the Bight of Biafra for a very, very long time during the 1700s and the early 1800s. And so when I use the word Igbo and I talk about the Igbo and I talk about the Bight of Biafra, sometimes I use those terms interchangeably, even though you shouldn't necessarily use the words interchangeably, because the Bight of Biafra consists of the region today known as Southeast Nigeria and parts of the Cameroon coast. All right. Now the Igbo people were the predominant group that came from the Bight of Biafra, and that's why sometimes I use these terms interchangeably. But I would say more specifically, if you're talking about the ports of Bonny, Calabar, and New Calabar, it's probably most likely, according to historians such as Douglas Chambers, that the majority of the Africans that were passing through these ports were specifically Igbo because of the proximity to the Igbo hinterland. All right, but generally speaking, when you're talking about captives from the Bight of Biafra, it's still an overwhelming majority of Africans passing through the ports. Even the ones extending down into the Cameroon region were likely to have been Igbo captives as well. All right, not to a great degree that they were from the Bonny and Calabar, New Calabar, but still, you still see this predominance from this region. So, just to give a little numerical breakdown of the African captives that were transported into slavery, specifically through the British West Indies, to talk about some of these colonies. Jamaica, for instance, which was one of the British West Indian colonies taken over by the British in the year 1655, their population of enslaved Africans, straight from the African continent, consisted of about 24.7% of all Africans transported into Jamaica from the beginning of their transatlantic slave trade to the end came from the Bight of Biafra. Second place for Jamaica was the 21.5% came from the Gold Coast. Then there was in West Central Africa about 13.1%. So those are the ethnic groups that predominated your Jamaican slave trade. Okay, so when you're thinking about Jamaican culture, you're thinking about things like that, you're thinking mostly about the culture coming from Southeast Nigeria, Bight of Biafra, most likely Igbo, and also the Akan people from the Gold Coast. And then, according to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database, there's a lot of unknown captives or unknown ports on the database, and so that comprises of about 24%. So what you're going to see I'm going to be doing here is, as I go down the list of the various British colonies that imported African captives from these various regions, I'm going to be mentioning the unknown regions as well. And these unknown regions can fall under any one of these regions. So this might actually boost the numbers of all the respective regions that I'm naming as well. Dominica, for example. Oh yeah, by the way, with Jamaica, if you look specifically, not at the entire time that Jamaica was importing African captives, but if you look specifically after the year 1763, then you see it's actually an even higher number. But specifically after the year 1763, the Bight of Biafra comprises of 36.2% of all Africans transported into Jamaica at that time. And whereas the other regions, the Gold Coast is 23%, and West Central Africa is 14%. And so it really seems like they stopped getting African captives from the Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and Windward Coast regions, and the Bight of Benin, because the other regions tended to increase, and the Bight of Biafra, the Bight of Biafra region especially increased, and so the other regions decreased a little bit. If you look at Dominica, for instance, of all the African captives that were transported into Dominica during the transatlantic slave trade era, 56% of them came from the Bight of Biafra. 9.2% of them came from the Windward Coast. 6% of them came from West Central Africa. And then you have 6.3% of them came from the Senegambia region. And then 13% of them were marked as other or unknown. Okay? That's Dominica. So you can see an overwhelming portion of Africans transported into Dominica came from the Bight of Biafra. And of this 56%, about 80% of them passed through only two ports, Bani and New Calabar, which were strictly Igbo type ports, Igbo regions. Go over to Barbados, same thing. Barbados, 17%, the majority portion that is, 17% of them that were transported into Barbados came from the Bight of Biafra. 16% came from the Gold Coast. 12% came from the Bight of Benin, and then 36% were marked as other. All right, Grenada, same thing. Grenada, 30% of them came from the Bight of Biafra. 16% of them came from the Gold Coast, and 10% of them came from West Central Africa, and 13.4% were marked as other. Virginia, same thing. 30% of them came from the Bight of Biafra. 12% of them came from Senegambia, and 11% came from West Central Africa, and then 33% of them were marked as other. Cuba also had a relatively large portion. 10% of them came from West Central Africa, 9% of them came from the Bight of Biafra. But see, Cuba's a little different because for Cuba, 66% of them were marked as other or unknown. So the Bight of Biafra region was actually the second most behind the West Central African region. So you can see these African captives from the Bight of Biafra, or particularly Igbo, made it into the transatlantic slave trade in very, very large numbers. Now, having said that, you really don't start seeing them get into the transatlantic slave trade in large numbers until right around the 1730s. And the reason why you start to see the Igbo falling victim to the transatlantic slave trade in the 1730s is because there were these merchants known as the Arrow merchants. And the Arrow merchants started to really incorporate their, they really started to get a handle and started to control and manipulate the society of the Igbo. And, you know, kind of like, I guess kind of like how I can compare it to today's terms, like the prison industrial complex, where lobbyists influence politicians to make certain laws in the books, and these laws in the books essentially make larger prison populations. Same kind of thing was working in Igbo society with the Arrow merchants. And they started to manipulate societal functions, and to the point where large portions of Igbo started to get traded into slavery right around the 1730s, and it started to skyrocket. But the Igbo, for a very long time, were a group that a lot of the whites didn't really like. They had, because the different European, the British, the French, all of them, they had their stereotypes, they had their characteristics of certain ethnic groups from Africa. They didn't view them all as being equal or equally valuable. Some of them were considered to be very, very hard workers and industrious, such as the Akan people. But if you rub them the wrong way, they will revolt. Others were considered thieves, others were considered this, but the Igbo particularly were considered to be a very, very, what they called a low-grade group of Negro, and very despondent and very, very prone to suicide and running away. So, because if you look at the history of the Igbo in various parts of the plantations throughout the Americas, slave traders and slave owners will always say the Igbo are always likely to commit suicide. And if they're not committing suicide, they're running away in large numbers. So, the question is this true? Is this not true? Well, if all these planters across Cuba, Virginia, Georgia, Dominica are all saying this about the Igbo, there's got to be a little bit of validity to this. But why are they saying this? Why are the Igbo more likely to commit suicide than some of these other Africans? And I think this is an important thing to understand about the Igbo. So where does this come from? Well, first, there are several examples. Like there was an example of this in off the coast of Georgia, what they call Igbo landing, right? There are a group of enslaved Africans, mostly Igbo, coming from the Bight of Biafra, that were getting ready to be sold off the coast of Georgia. These Africans all simultaneously committed suicide in a river, I believe was known as Dunbar Creek. These Igbo Africans committed mass suicide at this time. You also have the example, there was an example in Cuba that I was reading about, where Igbo Africans on a plantation all simultaneously committed suicide. Even in Dominica, they were characterized by the governor George Ainsley in the year 1814 as being predisposed to suicide, and they said this was one of the reasons that made them such great fighters in warfare, because they didn't care about death. In fact, they believed in the whole concept of give me liberty or give me death. Right? These Africans believed in liberty in the utmost way, right? And they were willing to die for that liberty. And to understand why these Africans had this predisposition to the suicide while being enslaved, you have to understand Igbo society. If you go back, the Igbo were what they called anthropologists, and everybody who's visited the region, they've known the Igbo to be an acephalous society, right? What is acephalous? This is a society without a head. The Igbo did not believe in being ruled, nor did they believe in ruling others. This was a concept that came from their very understanding of the universe, all right? Their understanding of the Uwa, all right? Now, they believed in living harmony with things and those around them. Some people may have referred to the Igbo as a stateless society, but then there's this historian by the name of Ife Amadume. Ife Amadume refers to them not as a stateless group of people, but an anti-state group of people. These people consciously made the decision not to be a part of a state. They were literally anti-state, anti-government type of group of people, because they believed that the government was inherently a controlling mechanism that took away people's liberty and took away people's freedom. And the government, in that sense, was an institution that created discord instead of harmony. Okay, so this is one of the things that's important to understand about the Igbo. They didn't like those concepts, and according to their understanding of the universe, this was anti-God and this was anti-harmony. And for the Igbo, God was harmony. There's an expression that goes, Igbo enwe ese. Igbo enwe ese means the Igbo has no king. The Igbo has no ruler. Now, they believe that not only do you live in harmony with those who are living, but you also live in harmony with those who have passed on. So you always have to acknowledge those who have gone beyond. You always have to acknowledge those who have yet to be born, and you have to acknowledge those who have passed on. All right, and this is why, like I've explained in other videos, the importance of pouring libations and acknowledging your ancestors, because you're all part of this system, all right, this ecosystem of existence, all right, where it's not just the physical things that you can see, but it's also the metaphysical things that you cannot see that are very important to the harmony of that person's universe. And when people in Igbo society start acting in a way, in a very aggressive way or a forceful way that goes against the notion of harmony, and this is when you start to see people trying to put things into place to make sure that all the needs and things are met in those people or in that society. So let me give you an example. There's this thing called the... Hey man, get off of me! Get off of me! Are you serious? Now my chicken just jumped on my shoulder, so I had to cut that video real quick. But these chickens are getting bold out here. With the Igbo people, there was an ancestral staff known as the Ofo. And the Ofo represents truth, justice, and righteousness. Okay? Truth, justice, and righteousness. This is a staff that was represented the ideals that was promoted in Igbo society. All right? There was also the Ikenga. Now, the Ikenga was another object that a lot of people, when the Westerners came into Nigeria, they looked at it as just a piece of artwork. But it also had very philosophical meanings for the Igbo people. And the Ikenga actually meant, it was the cult of achievement. It was about merit, okay? So Igbo society placed a lot of emphasis in the individual, in the individual's merit. It was a meritocracy, in essence, all right? Now, this didn't mean that, you know, you subjugated those who weren't able to achieve as much as you, but everybody's role, everybody's thing that they were good at. Everybody's an individual, and everybody can achieve greatness in their individual field. And so this is one of the things about Igbo society that they place a lot of importance in. And this is why this society was a society that was it was egalitarian, because there was no more value put in the role of a woman than there was of a man. There was no more value put in the role of a man than a woman. There was no more value put in one particular person's job over another person's particular job. But all these things played a role in keeping this whole society holistic, right? And one of the things that was considered like ominous in Igbo society was if someone committed suicide, right? If someone committed suicide in Igbo land, now I'm not talking about in the Americas, but in Africa itself, if they committed suicide, that was the worst possible thing you can do as an individual. And what you would see in Igbo society, they believe that if someone committed suicide, this would create all types of death, destruction, and famine, and create all types of bad luck in that particular society for that time. So when someone did commit suicide, you had to realize and you had to work very, very hard to make sure that you're putting things into place in a proper way to keep people living a happy and functional life. And usually, for the Igbo people, and for people in general, if people are allowed to be themselves and work and be the best selves they can be, this is when people usually live their best lives and usually are happy. But when you start putting societal pressures on people to not do this, do that, or you have to do this in order to be successful, you have to be good at that in order to get the status, this is what breeds, you know, a society where people might develop depression. Depression can lead to those suicidal kind of thoughts. So the Igbo society was all about creating harmony amongst the people. And with harmony amongst the people, you see these kinds of things happening. Now, like I said before, the decentralization of Igbo society, right? Voting through general consensus. It wasn't because they didn't have the ability to form a hierarchical society. In fact, throughout their early history, they did have hierarchical societies. In fact, the Igbo people, if you go back far enough, you will see a very stratified, centralized society at times. But you see the Igbo people made a conscious effort to avoid that kind of society. Even if you go and you ask somebody about when West Africans, reached the Iron Age, they would say, oh, they didn't reach the Iron Age until the Colonials got there, and after the Berlin Conference in 1884, 1885. But if you look at the Igbo people of Southeast Nigeria, in a small village called Leja, in a town called Nsukka, in Southeast Nigeria, there is evidence to point towards the fact that the Igbo people were actually smelting iron as far back as 2000 BC. You can read this article written by a woman by the name of Pamela Ese Usumaka. Pamela Ese Usumaka, she wrote a whole article on this, and others have also written articles on this, that the Igbo people were actually producing these things. And there's also these pyramids that you can find all throughout in certain parts of Southeast Nigeria. When the Colonials got there in the early 1900s, there were these pyramids there, and these pyramids are where some of the iron work was actually being conducted. All right, Even if you fast forward to the 9th century, you have the Igbo bronzes. These Igbo bronzes were discovered in the same type of fashion by once the colonialists got there in the 1900s. You start to see people digging up certain parts of the land and all kinds of stuff. And eventually there was a Nigerian farmer there that actually discovered these Igbo bronzes, and there was a plethora of them, and some of these things you can find in British museums to this day. But if you look at the fine writing and the fine designs on those Igbo bronzes, some people think these things are just random designs, and some people think that these things are just decorations. But there was an actual language amongst the Southeast Nigerian Africans, the Igbo, the Efu, the Efik, the Ejagam. These Africans actually had a writing system known as Nnsibidi. And you can find the Nnsibidi, the origins of Nnsibidi, probably tracing back to the year 200 AD. Some people say even farther back than that, on what they call the Ikon monoliths. These Ikon monoliths were these stones that were found all throughout southeast part of Nigeria as well when the colonialists got there. And there were all types of hieroglyphic type of writings on these things, and writings that people say are connected to the writing system known as Nnsibidi. Now, Nnsibidi was not a very centralized writing system, and it varied depending upon what secret society you were part of or what community you lived in, etc. But it was there, and that was the thing. So the Igbo people had a knowledge of these writing systems, and they put these writings on their skins and on their as scarification and things like that. So even if you look at the planters' records in Dominica, for instance, you'll find that a lot of the Igbo there actually had what they called country marks, scarification representing those things. When the Igbo came to the Americas and got transported into slavery in the Americas, being enslaved was the antithesis of their idea of life, and they were unwilling to accept it. And so when you see them committing suicide in such large numbers in America, and it was something that was so frowned upon in Africa, this was the society that they were living in was basically flipped upside down on its head. And because the Igbo people believed in living in harmony with nature and harmony with things around them, they placed a lot of importance in being connected to the land. Even when their newborn babies were born, and when they cut the umbilical cord, they actually put the umbilical cord in the ground. That connection to the ground, and that connection to the ancestors who are buried in that ground, and those children that are going to be coming from that same area, from that same earth. There was very much a connection here with the Igbo people. So this is like very important to understand. And the Igbo believe that the farther and farther away, spatially and temporally, that you were from your family, from your ancestors, from that umbilical cord, when you died, the worse off you were going to be, and the more out of rhythm you were going to be with that harmonious family cycle that you're supposed to be a part of. So this is why the Igbo committed suicide. And they also believed in the transmigration of the soul. But one thing was, the way that some of these Europeans were able to deter these Africans from committing suicide, to deter the Igbo from committing suicide, is because the Igbo believed in the transmigration of the soul. If your body dies, if you die and your body remains intact at death, they believe the soul transmigrates back amongst your family, right? And you become reincarnated eventually. But if you die and then someone butchers your body, mutilates your body, or burns your body, then the soul will not live on. So these are some of the tactics that some of the European colonials actually inflicted upon the Africans, upon the Igbo in these days. The Igbo people were a very phenomenal group. You see, they believed in very free concepts. They were what we in the West might refer to as an enlightened group of people. They believed in the concept of very, very limited, if no government at all. They were an anti-state society. They were what many might call libertarians in today's terms. And they believed in, they were a meritocracy believing group of people as well. They placed a lot of emphasis in the individual, but the individual was also a part of a community, all right? And they believed that if you allow the individual to be free, then the community can function in harmony in a much better way. and not have to worry about any type of discordance or anything like that going on. So was it Thomas Jefferson that came up with the concepts of that all men are created equal, and if the government proves and shows and demonstrates that it's unwilling or unable to keep the promises to the people, that the people have the right to overthrow or abolish that government? Was it him that came up with these concepts? Was it John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Thomas Paine that came up with the concept of questioning their government and questioning the control that the government has over the people, that the people have the right to overthrow and abolish their governments? Or was it Patrick Henry that came up with the concept of give me liberty or give me death? Or did these concepts come out of Africa? Did they come out of the Bight of Biafra region? Did they come out of the land of the Igbo, where the Igbo believed in the concept of egalitarian society based on individual freedom and liberty? Was it the Igbo that came into the Americas and forced the hand of this U.S. government to live up to its principles in the so-called founding documents? This is something to take into consideration. See, these Europeans put these things in words on these documents. But I think if you look at the actions of the Igbo and all their slave revolts that they engaged in, whether it was in Barbados, whether it was in Virginia, whether it was in Dominica, whether it was in Jamaica, and some of these other colonies throughout the West Indies, you'll find that they put in all their efforts to ensure the fact that they would rise up and revolt and gain their freedom by any means necessary.
We declare our right on this earth to be a man, to be a human being, to be respected as a human being, to be given the rights of a human being in this society, on this earth, in this day, which we intend to bring into existence by any means necessary.